to show our dissatisfaction to kick that leader out from the government.
We have a question from Gideon Feen, and he's asking how your protest movement and organization has adapted to the pandemic. I know obviously that you have been very good on that front, but what was the process like, and how do you keep it moving when we've seen in so many places around the world that the pandemic has given the police more powers, or we've seen the military actually take up a much more visible role in managing and enforcing law?
No doubt at all how Beijing took the advantage during the outbreak of COVID-19 when the world is dealing with the pandemic export from China to the world, and they suddenly plan to introduce this evil law to Hong Kong and to silence the voice of the civil society. It's lucky that the COVID-19 outbreak in Hong Kong almost ended already. So in the previous few months, apart from importing surgical masks all over the world, we also have virtual protests to have the protests online. And we also will gather people on social media and how to keep our momentum by different kind of online live stream or etc. And on June 4th, which is the commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre, 2 weeks ago, even Beijing and Hong Kong government banned our authorized assembly. More than 100,000 people still never forget how Beijing cracked down on the protests 31 years ago in Tiananmen Square. And when even with the excuse of the COVID-19, how the government stopped our protests, we still gather on street and hope to keep the momentum. And we hope to let the world to know that when Beijing is taking advantage, no matter during the outbreak of COVID-19, silence the voice of activists and dissidents and journalists in China, Hong Kong, and all over the world. At the same time, they also hope to have more interference in the economic sector. And we also hope to put pressure and let the world to know that it's not only about the fight for Hong Kong. The first is Hong Kong, the next is Taiwan, and later on is the rest of the world.
It's a very important point. If I can switch it now to one last question. Obviously, in many protest movements, the involvement of other institutions, for example, large companies, can be quite important, or it's of increasing importance in many of those movements. So I want to give a personal example here. I have a mortgage with a bank called HSBC. They've recently said that essentially they would support Beijing when it came down to the crunch. What do you hope someone like me does to show solidarity with the protesters, given the stance of companies like HSBC?
I perfectly understand big companies are under great pressure because of the pandemic. At the same time, in Hong Kong, HSBC is often the target of political attack by pro-Beijing political leader, accusing this major bank in Hong Kong not patriotic enough to the communist regime and was a colonial financial institution. Under such heavy pressure, however, it doesn't make bowing to China or kowtow to Beijing recognized as kind of wise choice. It affects the reputation of HSBC in the global economy. Especially HSBC staff in Hong Kong could risk violating the law by merely writing accurate financial analysis. I think as investor, the best way to safeguard your interests is to voice out when you find something goes wrong. That's how a democratic society should work like. Especially Hong Kong is more than compromise the place I call home. And when Hong Kong is in the difficult times, I think it's not only about the fight of Hong Kong, especially when we stand on the forefront to confront the largest authoritarian regime, we are also sharing the value that the free world stands for. So how to speak up as the stakeholders and also one of the investors, I think is also matter, especially how red capital interference in Hong Kong or Beijing affecting the global economy and never respect on economic freedom, which is really critical. Lots of people might always assume that the protest in Hong Kong is just about political right. Of course, the right to elect our government is important. But for no matter the controversial extradition bill in 2019, or right now the national security law in Hong Kong, is not only about political issue, it's also about the economic freedom, the free market, free port, and also the free flow of information might fade out soon after the law is implemented in the upcoming few weeks. So I will sum up, the clock is kicking and time is running out in Hong Kong, and we really call on the world to stand with us and let Beijing to realize that this fight is not only about Hong Kong.
That's a very important point to end on. The clock's also ticking on us, Joshua, so I have to say thank you and goodbye there. But I want to remind everyone that you'll be answering questions on Twitter starting in about 15 minutes. So if you have more questions that we didn't cover here, use the hashtag AskJWong, and Joshua will be there on Twitter answering them for you. Thank you so much for joining us, Joshua.
Thank you.
Now, coming up next,
like in Hollywood or in CBS. 1, 2, 3, go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Heath, Senior Editor at Politico, and welcome back to the virtual Copenhagen Democracy Summit. We've now got a new panel for you. It's a large panel, so I'm going to run through the introductions now. We are talking about United in Democracy We Stand. So this is democracy promotion and the state of democracy around the world. Things could get a little unwieldy. I think we've got 6 of us on here. So I want to warn you that we might have to take comments in turn, and then I certainly encourage the panelists to respond to each other as well as to my questions so that we have as dynamic a conversation as possible. So let me do a quick round of introductions and we'll get right into it. First, I want to introduce to you Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka. She's a fellow dealing with human freedom at the George W. Bush Institute. Hello, Nicole.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Next up, Kevin Casas Zamora. He's Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or IDEA, as some of us know it. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Next is Derek Mitchell. He's President of the National Democratic Institute. Hello, Derek.
Well, Brian, thank you.
Then fourth in the list, we have Jerzy Pomanowski. He's Executive Director of the European Endowment for Democracy. Hi, Jerzy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, we've got Daniel Twining, who's President of the International Republican Institute. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having us.
Okay, we've got a lot to get through, but we've also got an hour to do it, so it's going to be a great conversation. First, I think maybe it makes sense if I ask each of you to go through a 2-minute introduction on what are the key things we can be doing to defend democracy in this time of political disruption and often crisis. Nicole, could you kick us off?
Absolutely, and thanks for starting. That's the most crucial question we should be grappling with right now. We're seeing a tremendous number of serious challenges in the world, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's the concerns about the lack of justice in any number of countries, whether it is disinformation campaigns and undermining of democratic governments around the world. What we can be doing right now has many different levels. So on a global level, we absolutely should be looking at how democracies around the world are working more intensively and closely with each other to hold a very strong line against authoritarianism, whether that is challenging when we see authoritarianism at home, as we do in China, where we see the internment of Uyghurs, or whether that is when we see Russia engaging in undermining democratic elections. Internally, each of us should be thinking from a governmental standpoint as well as an advocacy standpoint, how we can be shoring up the institutions in our government to ensure that our governments the democratic institutions are functioning as well as they can be. That means that there are checks and balances, that the rule of law is held to, that justice is something that is shared for all people in a society. And of course, it's not just a governmental action, it's something that citizens, journalists, activists need to be actively engaged in because they are an essential part of our governments.
Unmute myself. That's a big faux pas when it comes to being a moderator, I guess. Kevin, maybe you can pick up the baton. Is one of those institutions that we really need to be defending the voting process, and what else can we be defending?
The whole package. I think that the first thing that we need to do is exactly what we're doing here, is drawing attention to the plight of democracy in the midst of this emergency. I mean, and making sure that people and governments understand that just as this crisis is already having dramatic economic and social consequences, it's likely to have very profound political consequences. And I think that I'm pretty sure that we're gonna run through the whole gamut of risks and dangers for democracy stemming out of the current emergency. One big risk that we are facing at this time is connected to the use and abuse of emergency powers, and the fact that those emergency powers, which are a legitimate part of the arsenal of democratic systems to deal with emergencies such as this one, can be abused and can become the norm in democratic systems. And here I would introduce a slight nuance. For me, the most important danger is that they can become the norm, not simply because authoritarian leaders demand those powers, but because a fearful citizenry tolerate it. And that's where the real danger is, I think. So that's a big danger looming in the horizon. And then there's a second danger, which is kind of doesn't come from action, but from omission, which is the danger that we don't learn the right lessons from this crisis. I mean, this crisis is showcasing in dramatic ways the very profound fault lines that are wreaking havoc with our societies. I mean, social fault lines, political fault lines, economic fault lines. So the danger is that we just go back to normal, without any kind of, without giving thought to renegotiating the social contract, and without giving thought to a long overdue rebalancing between states, markets, and societies. I think it is becoming dramatically clear the steep price that societies pay when they underprovide public goods in a systematic way for a long time, particularly healthcare. So there's a very big danger in the possibility of simply going back to a kind of normalcy that is not there anymore. So we really have to draw the right lessons from this crisis and try to act upon them.
Derek, maybe can you pick up on Kevin's point about inequalities? That for sure has struck me. It was right in front of our noses the entire time, and now it is simply unavoidable. And I'd love to know how much that's influencing NDI's work going forward.
Well, absolutely. And thank you again, Ryan. I completely agree with Kevin when he talks about the dangers of inequality, as you say. But the biggest danger to democracy, or one of them, is fear and insecurity. When people are fearful and they're insecure, if they're insecure because of their economic situation, their health situation, then they allow for extraordinary measures and demagogues to say, you must do these things, otherwise we will be hurt. And those are the biggest dangers now, I think, as Kevin outlined. But there are opportunities as well. And those opportunities are the fact that democracies, the strongest democracies, are doing pretty well right now. It's a test of governance, this moment. Test of how strong civil society is. Test how strong the democratic principles of transparency and accountability are. Civic trust in a society. So now you're seeing a lot of democracies doing well. Places like South Korea or Taiwan, the litany. Denmark is one that's on that list. And I think what we need to do, two things. One is we have to get that word out. We have to win the information war on this, because the autocrats are trying to make the case that democracies can't handle this kind of thing, that you need to have strong, authoritarian leadership that plays to their advantages, their strengths, which is that strong central control. But you have to demonstrate, actually, that's not the way to get this done, that the democracies are doing well, and make sure that message is getting out there. But as well, what we're doing at NDI is we see the opportunities of working with civil society, working with others to keep the fires burning, to go online. More and more things are in the digital domain, counter disinformation, try to link up civil society, use things like election methodology to get health information out, and to deal with inequities within society, which is absolutely critical. I mean, I think those inequities around the world lead to a sense that this is corrupt. This is only working for some people. This is regardless of COVID. This is before COVID and will remain after COVID. But when there are inequities and the sense that the government is not working for everybody equally, it's working only for an oligarchy or a certain percentage of the society, people get frustrated. And you'll see that in the far left and the far right in countries around the world. And I think now is a time we can level set some of that information and expose some of the, I think, the corruption that lies at the center of a lot of these governments.
Thanks so much. Jersey, we saw from the Alliance's Democracy Perceptions Index that up to 40% of people who live in democracies don't feel that they actually live in a democracy. And some of the lowest figures came from countries within the EU. How does that change the way you do your job in the EU's backyard?
Thank you. This is a very complex issue, and I think we are working very closely with the people on the ground, because we are basically grant-making institution. So we are receiving a lot of signals from our activists and people we support. And when you ask a question, what's going on also within EU, the answer is very simple, and that is the answer that is not only related to COVID, but it's related to overall democracy support. Wherever I speak to the European Parliament or to the European Union member states, I always try to repeat, whatever we do for them, we do for ourselves. If we believe those values and we want to exercise them here within EU, we have credibility to promote those values elsewhere. If we lose that credibility, the democracy support concept will disappear, will just cease to exist. So from this perspective, I'm very much engaged in collecting now as many voices from the ground, how people on the ground, first, they fight with their own reality. Those people, those democracy activists in the countries where democratic transition is either present or partially only achieved, or in the authoritarian regimes. And my intention is also, apart from just helping them to transmit their message toward democratic community, toward donor community. And I think through those listening activities, we already identify several very important threats to democracy that I would like to quickly share with you. We can talk in details later, but just to highlight. The first, we observe in many countries excessive use of violence by security forces. So those very violent approaches are present. And as we could see, they are also happening in the democratic countries, not only in the countries in transition. Second, Second, we are seeing elections that are interrupted or manipulated. And again, this is element that accompanies the fears and the threat of pandemic. Then we see opportunistic clampdowns on political opponents, whether Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, Kazakhstan, Turkey. These are just few countries I would mention where we could see this as an extremely visible element. Then we see the censorship and threats to independent media, extremely important element and important threat. Then finally, we see the increasing disinformation and this infodemic. It's already a well-used term, but something we have to be aware that this is on one hand a threat, on the other hand an opportunity, because at the same time, many of our partners on the ground from independent media, they are saying much more new users of independent media emerge during pandemic. So every crisis is an opportunity. And here we also see an important opening for all of us, for democracy support organizations, for democratic governments to use this opportunity. So we should find the ways to do it. But if we talk about disinformation, I think one of the results for me personally in this pandemic is final recognition of China as supplier of disinformation, which was not that present in different gatherings and meetings. So far, Russia was only pointed. Now, this company of leaders in disinformation, Russia, Iran, China, is well recognized who they are and what they do. And this is something we have to also think about how we tackle this global challenge. So I will not mention issues that are of extreme importance, like minority groups and vulnerable groups, harassment and using, or also dividing, polarizing society, using them as a kind of victims of the crisis of the security situation. That is obvious. Same obvious subject that we often discuss is, and we receive as a signals, is use of digital technology to do illegal surveillance on people, on citizens. This is also a very important issue. But I understand we will talk more about specific elements of what we do. What I wanted to do is just to list those key threats that, as I said, we are not a think tank. We are collecting those feedbacks from the people on the ground who are living in those realities, and they are bringing those stories to us. But we are trying to make out of it also a certain general reflection, and we are working now together with the several organizations on policy paper, policy advice toward government, democratic governments, international organizations, how in the best way we address those threats, and at the same time, how we use this opportunity to build a kind of new community of people who believes in democracy and who will be ready to fight for democracy. This policy paper will be published in a few weeks.
Great, thank you, Jerzy. Maybe I can pick up a couple of those points and moving over to Dan, that point about leading by example and treatment of minorities. We saw some extraordinary scenes at the UN Human Rights Council yesterday, which is a body that's come under severe criticism since it was set up. Essentially, American critics and foes piling on around the treatment of African Americans at the hands of police, or more generally, and some of the biggest human rights violators in the world sort of having a door to walk through there. Dan, how much do situations like that complicate the work that you are trying to do in defending democracy when everything can be constructed as a gray zone in the public debate?
Thanks, Ryan. I'm glad you raised the issue, because we should certainly talk about what's happening in the United States very directly as part of this. Look, the UN Human Rights Council is populated, as you suggested, by many of the world's greatest human rights abusers. So we understand exactly what's going on there. The UN Human Rights Council has not held extensive hearings or investigations into re-education camps in Xinjiang. It has not acted on gross human rights abuses in so many countries around the world. The good news about democracy is that it is self-correcting and creates the best channels for people to influence how their government works and how government does protect their rights, and what more governments can do to do that. So in America, I think a lot of us are actually very proud of what we've seen here in the last few weeks in terms of very peaceful forms of people power that we've seen in all 50 states. You know, this is not strictly something new or strictly something American. In fact, 2019 and 2020, certainly at least before COVID, were the most significant period for people power in the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were more street actions that we saw all over the world in this period over the last 18 months or so than we have seen really at any time since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, all over the world. What you're seeing in America is another example of people power. It's another example of how our citizens, frankly, for 240 years, have used peaceful forms of protest and dissent to secure their equal rights and try to make our country better. I think the reason we're all in the democracy business and the reason democracy is the best model and example of government is that it creates these channels for citizens to help improve their country, channels that don't exist in China or Russia or Syria or Venezuela or so many other countries. And so in a democracy, luckily we have institutions, we have free media, we have oversight and checks and balances, and a democracy amplifies citizen voices in ways that frankly they are simply suppressed and repressed and persecuted in so many autocracies. So democracy contains the seeds of its own renewal and continuous self-improvement. There is no perfect democracy in the world, not the United States, not any country. And actually it requires active citizen engagement to make sure to hold governments accountable for securing equal rights and equal justice for all citizens. And, you know, I think we're proud of that as Americans. I think we're proud as Europeans, as others, in this group, in this gathering, that our people care about justice and dignity and freedom in the world because we care about those issues in our own countries. It would be perverse if we didn't care about them in our own countries. But that is why we are so motivated by this cause of democracy in the world. And really the imperative, as many of you have pointed out, of protecting democracy from the autocratic challenge that we see out there from China, from Russia, from other very malign actors that want to exploit this for reasons that have nothing to do with our citizens' rights or theirs.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that's a really important point. Maybe if I come back to you, Nicole, I think back to my own time growing up as a student, and well, it was also my early career, I'm not that young, in the George W. Bush administration, where I think sort of defending and promoting democracy came to define a lot of his international reputation, but certainly nobody accused George W. Bush of being an authoritarian. And that is something that some critics do say about the current president. So I just want to know how the Trump playbook intersects with the work that you do and whether it, you know, makes it more difficult or is something that helps you renew your efforts to challenge authoritarianism wherever you find it.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on some of the points which Dan made, which is really to pick out this point that there is no perfect democracy. And I think what we see, and we saw this under President Bush, is that he was able to both deal with some of the issues at home, but also talk about promoting democracy and standing with democratic activists around the world. And basically it was to the points that were made previously, it was not an either or, right? And I think what we have seen is this effort, particularly by the case of authoritarian governments, to make it say we either talk about the United States or us. But what we really have to do is shift this conversation to say, look, these are universal values. These are values that we share at the United States, as well as many countries around the world. And we can both work on what's going on at home, as well as what's going on in other countries. I think the fact that President Trump has chosen to step away significantly from democratic values, from the operations of our democratic institutions with integrity, has certainly been a step backwards in American democracy. The fact that he doesn't speak openly about democracy at home and democracy abroad is a significant step, which hurts the United States government's credibility abroad. But as has been pointed out, what we're seeing from American citizens who are going into the streets to talk about injustice, to talk about ensuring that our democracy operates fully for all people, is a sign that democracy is strong in many ways in the United States, and that it is something where we can continue to improve and continue to work. And I do think this is an opportunity for us to look at both how we can promote and support democracy overseas, by also saying we have challenges at home and that we will stand with those who want to see those democratic values strengthened and expanded in their societies. And we do that with humility and with confidence that we do that in partnership with other democracy activists around the world.
Can I say, Ryan, I just jump in real quick on this, which I think also an important point. I do think that, and I'll defer to my European colleagues or others who are listening, that I'm sure there's a lot of disappointment or concern about what's happening in the United States, both at the governmental level and what's happening in the past several weeks in terms of our society and the racial issues. But you know, around the world, I'm sure they're also thinking more about themselves and about us. They're doing this because people around the world want their own dignity, they want their own rights. And they're, you know, I think American leadership matters a lot on this. The American model matters a lot, but people are focused on their own situations. And they're not waiting for America to have a perfect model democracy in order to demand the rights and dignity that they think is theirs. And the fact is, even as Americans who recognize that our system is not perfect and never has been, and we have this huge problem at the whole of our founding, basically, we still believe that a democratic world is more just, more stable, more secure for everybody equally, and that we just need to keep fighting for it everywhere. And to the degree that we have problems at home, they're shown out in the open, and we're going to deal with them openly. They're not hidden, and we will partner with others around the world to try to make our system better, just as we are helping others make their systems better for themselves. So I want to make sure that we're not just focused on ourselves here in the United States and just holding our head down, but continuing the broader fight that is going to be everlasting, frankly.
Kevin, I see you motioning. Would you like to jump in there?
Yeah. I mean, this is really very, very interesting and very timely. One of the issues that is seldom remarked in the course of these discussions is that a big part of the story of the irresistible expansion of democracy globally over the past half a century has been connected to the fact that the single most important international actor is a liberal democracy. And that has a twofold implication. If this leading actor gives up on liberal values and adopts practices that run counter to the liberal underpinnings of its political system, democracy globally will suffer. And I'm very concerned about the effect, quite frankly, that the past 3 years may have had on the soft power of the US to promote democracy globally. I would like to think that this is not irrecoverable, but it is a very visible effect. And the other thing that we have to bear in mind is that, and again, I'm not saying that this will happen, but this may happen, that once the dust settles a few years from now, after this crisis, we might wake up in a world where the leading international actor is no longer a liberal democracy. And that will have implications. I mean, that will make the task of expanding the democratic creed all the more hard for all of us that care about democracy. So the geopolitical implications of this crisis will have a bearing on democracy and on the task that is in our hands going forward.
That gives me a chance to bring in an audience question as a follow-up to what you're saying there, Kevin. So the question comes from Elsa Christensen Redzipovic. I hope I got that right, from the European Commission. And it's a question about what your organizations are doing to utilize culture as a tool for defending and fostering democracy. And the reason I thought it's good to bring that in now is I think it's probably fair to say that the soft power of official America has declined in the last 3 years for all the reasons we've discussed. At the same time, the ability of a civil rights movement in the US to spark action or much needed discussion in Europe, where Europeans often feel like they don't have a racism problem or a police brutality problem, for example. The power of American tech companies to create platforms to facilitate democracy, and for all the problems on the Facebooks of the world, the Democracy Perception Index did show that essentially majorities in every country think that social platforms have a positive effect on democracy in their country. Bringing all that together, are there other aspects to soft power and American soft power that need to be considered alongside what the administration does? Anyone, feel free to jump in.
And maybe I'll start, but I'm happy to defer to my colleagues. But just to open it up, I mean, it's a great question. Soft power, by definition, does not emanate from a government. Soft power emanates from a society. I mean, this is partly why, frankly, Kevin, I certainly share your concern about a world that's safe for Chinese autocracy, that the Chinese Communist Party does want to build a values-neutral world in which nobody challenges their very repressive form of government. So, of course, that is something that keeps us all up at night. But fundamentally, China does not enjoy a lot of soft power. I mean, you actually see a backlash to China when they try to promote some of their sort of cultural and civilizational instruments. And the fact is that an autocratic regime is never going to be very good at this because it's directed by the state. Soft power flows from society, from citizens, from free and open debate, from all of the innovation that you see not controlled by the government. So in fact, I think as small d Democrats, I think we're pretty confident about sort of the soft power question. It's not as if Russian soft power offers some superior example, or Chinese soft power that everybody in the world is striving for. So that's one. I think the other point here is that fundamentally, one thing you're going to see in the United States, democracies have a terrific ability to refresh themselves. Democracy is not about the leader. Actually, the Chinese system, the Russian system is about the leader. Democracy is about the people and institutions. And so I think things could look quite different here down the road in terms of the look at the United States. And again, I think the debate we're having in America about equal rights for all our citizens actually is really powerful. And if that debate were to happen in a country like China, it would be quite revolutionary and quite dangerous for the ruling system.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who wanted to respond to that? Otherwise, I can come to Jersey with a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, Jersey, I had a different question for you, but please also feel free to respond.
No. I am happy to hear another question, because also it's nice to hear many questions, because all of them I believe are very relevant.
Well, I wanted to pick up your point, one of your points about minorities that you made in your opening statement. And it really struck me that often Europeans don't see themselves as having the problems convulsing America right now around its treatment of its minority communities. Because often those communities are simply invisible. People don't see the problem because they don't see the community, which is not something that you can say of the US. And what really came out for me was I noticed how invisible the situation of the Roma population in Europe has been in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, we were dealing with the treatment of Black communities when this protest movement sparked, but I noticed that Roma communities, which are large in a lot of the countries that you deal with, are kind of written out of this picture of systemic racism. And I wondered if you had any reactions to that and how that affects the ability to build a cohesive society that can actually move forward together.
Well, this is absolutely one of those signals that we are constantly receiving during the COVID pandemic, that of course minority rights and vulnerable groups are affected most because of for many reasons. And the range of issues that we may even not see, because there are obvious elements like Roma people or racism that when we talk about that naturally comes to our mind as something that is potentially under threat, and we have proofs of it. And I can give you a few examples, but there are also elements of minority rights that we even cannot think today. Like, for example, we are receiving signals from Lebanon, where the huge group of people who are domestic workers were during pandemic simply overnight left over on the streets. Ethiopians and others living in Lebanon, mostly illegally. And suddenly, this is a group without any rights. So the state has no formula to address their needs. And we as international community, we don't even see it. But when you are looking into activists on the ground who are looking for the human rights violations, who are observing situation, and it is developing day by day, they are signaling to us such issues. But coming to the more systemic issues that you absolutely rightly pointed, the Roma people in Europe and their rights are very much dangerous, and we have noticed several of such a situation. Our partner Romanet in Montenegro have absolutely sent a lot of warning signals about racism against Roma, not only in Montenegro but in the Balkan region and in that part of the Europe. Same in Armenia, we are receiving from our partner Fem House that we will hear more today. They will tell their stories. That increasing discrimination against LGBT community. In Georgia, the offices of Tbilisi Pride were just attacked last week. And you know, these things happens also without pandemic, but during the pandemic, there is of course natural social phenomenon of increasing social frustration. People are locked down, people are staying in their homes, their feeling of frustration and aggression grows. And then they are actors who are trying to use this type of frustration and simply drive them toward certain minority groups to say, here you can release your frustration. And this is extremely dangerous way of gathering popularity or gathering attention, because you can release demon or such a behavior from the bottle, but put it back together is extremely difficult. So that is an extreme threat that has to be tackled on daily basis. And thanks to those civil society activists on the ground, it is tackled. And I think this is one of the most important part of not only our mission, but all democracy support community mission to make sure they have resources to tackle those issues and to address those absolutely unacceptable phenomena that are happening. So here I do confirm the vulnerable minority groups in every sense are suffering more than average in a society.
Thank you. I've got another audience question now. It comes from Joella Hamati, and she's the president of the European Democracy Youth Network. The question is based around political systems and elites that were out of touch before COVID, and how the problems exposed by COVID show even greater need to adapt. So the question for all or any of you is, what are some things that young people can do to help political systems adapt, to help democracy adapt to the post-COVID world? Maybe Nicole, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I would love to jump in on that. On my day job, I'm a professor at Georgetown University, so I spend most of my day with folks who are in their 20s and 30s. And there's such a tremendous activism among people of that generation to change the world, to make an impact. There's a significant number of ways that they can do that. Obviously, getting involved in political parties and the structure of democracy in their country is a really important way, and looking for what are the opportunities that they can put on the agenda of the political parties in their country, the issues which are passionate, that young people are passionate about. Certainly there are any number of non-governmental organizations and advocacy organizations that young people can also get involved in. But likewise, we see just the tremendous impact that social movements have via social platforms, social media platforms that allow us to put issues on the agenda of our policymakers and of international organizations. And so whether it's through formal structures or whether it's through informal advocacy, there's a tremendously important role for young people to play in engaging institutions and engaging the society. I think it's also important that young people become democracy activists for their generation. There's a lot of activism around climate change and around around individual issues, which are extraordinarily important. But what's important is also for many of these young people to realize that the ability to move those issues forward will depend on a democratic system that allows for that activism, that creates the space for that activism, but also allows for an open and transparent public policy process that allows for change. So as the young people are engaging in that activism, it's important that they become little D democracy activists as well as they move forward.
Have we got any other reactions? Maybe Dan, if you wanted to react to that at all. Oh, Derek, sorry.
It's Derek's turn.
Yeah,
Oh.
it is Derek's turn.
First of all, Eden, and where Ms. Hamati is the leader, is one of our proudest partners, both IRI and NDI. Work with them, so it's wonderful to hear a question from her. Look, I think young people, first of all, there is definitely a generational difference, generational divide in the way young people are looking at things, whether it's climate change or whether their involvement in democracy. They're being online, understanding the digital space. This is going to be absolutely critical to figure out how do we harness digital technologies for democracy, rather than what we've seen so far is the bad guys using the digital space to build, to create more disinformation, to create more confusion. So I think young people can help us think that through. I think they need to also take the activism that they put online. They have to figure out a way to channel it. This is one of the biggest challenges, is how do we channel that activism and put it into productive, constructive, and organized activity that contributes to governance, that contributes to actual change in a systemic way within a society. Because we're seeing the activism of protest. We're seeing go out to the streets. We're seeing things online. But then that's just an activist activity. That's not a sustained effort that is channeled into governance. And we have to figure out ways with young people of how to do that. And then finally, we need to network young people in the United States with young people in Europe and Africa and Asia, across different borders, talking together about their commonality, about their unique challenges. I think that networking is going to be very important for building that sort of global community in an era where borders are less and less important, and where some of these values are going to be very, very more and more important as other actors seek to shape a different future for them.
Maybe I'll pick up there and bring you in, Dan, because there's a question that links back in to that thought process about how do you move from the activism to the governance. I think one thing we see a lot of with young people today is that given the frustration they have with some democratic institutions, they often identify with brands now. They often seek to put their money and their income behind companies and organizations that align with their values. And the question from Rasmus Bertelsen is, what role do multinational companies play in the broader fight to defend democracy globally? Over to you, Dan.
Well, maybe I should start with a little bit different angle, because it
was.
I was asking Dan to chip in.
Okay.
Come to you after that, Josie.
Don't worry. Later on.
No, so it's a very interesting question. I'm interested in my colleagues' views too. There are several issues here. I mean, one is that free markets require free people, that the open and productive economy that all of our countries enjoy is not a politically neutral phenomenon. It is not coincidental that all of the richest countries in the world are open systems with rule of law, with secure property rights, with independent institutions, right? This is not a trivial correlation. It's actually quite central. If we're interested in everybody in the world being able to enjoy the fullest forms of human and economic development, they need political accountability. They need equal justice, equal rule of law, all of the things that a democratic structure aspires to. And the private sector is obviously central in a free and open economy to producing that degree of wealth that underwrites democratic order. That doesn't mean that only countries that are rich can be democratic, but it's to say that open markets and free societies are mutually reinforcing in quite powerful and important ways. And this is an important point, I think, in an era when some of our young people are quite attracted to socialist ideals. Of course, they never saw them put into practice in sort of the Soviet Empire or in countries like Venezuela, where actually, when these things are actually put into practice, they destroy free economies and free people. So there is that link. And then last thing I'll say for now, because there's a lot of space to run on this question, Ryan, is the question of a free and open internet and what is the role of the private sector. On the one hand, there are concerns in the United States, certainly in Europe, that Facebook, Alphabet, Microsoft, that these are big dominant corporations that need to be cut down to size. There is that view out there. There is also the fact that a lot of these technology platforms that have changed all of our way of life have been produced by these and other companies, and that they are game changers. And I think sort of hopefully driving forces for free and open speech, free and open debate, and that if we were, say, to replace American tech dominance with, say, Chinese tech dominance, speech would suffer. That free and open information environment, that digital analog of the free society in cyberspace would be kneecapped. And so I do think there's a fundamental debate about the role of the private sector when it comes to the free and open internet. I'm not sure I'm entirely pleased with where that debate is right now, because in fact, these are just foundational issues for free societies, that you cannot sustain liberal democracy in the real world if you cannot sustain the same open principles of transparency and speech online. Thank you.
Yeah, Kevin, wanted to bring you in there as well.
Well, I mean, you know, I don't need to be convinced of the value that free markets have for democracy. I mean, we have to acknowledge that that correlation is not perfect. I mean, China has shown abundantly over the past generation that you can have a reasonably free market without democracy. The thing is that free markets come in different shapes. And here it is essential that we recognize that whatever values, you know, whatever value free markets have for democracy, they're not good at distributing wealth. And the question of inequality has to be taken very seriously. And it's a question, by the way, that has, I mean, whose importance has been revealed in a very stark way by the current pandemic. And here I'm going to give you, you know, a factoid that I think is quite extraordinary. I mean, it comes from the United States. You know, over the past 2 months, over 40% of the jobs paying less than $40,000 per year have disappeared in the US. At the same time, US-based billionaires have added 434 billion to their fortunes, according
565 to now. 565 now, Kevin. Sorry to disappoint you.
What is that?
565 billion now.
Well, there you go. There you go. So, you know, the virus is not man-made, but the patterns of its dissemination and its consequences most certainly are. So it is essential, if we want free markets to underpin democracy, we have to take the question of inequality very seriously, because it's wreaking havoc with societies and it's wreaking havoc with democracy. You know, and again, you know, since I'm giving factoids, I'll give you one that I find extraordinarily disturbing, and it comes from the region of the world where I come from. If you see the latest regional poll done by Latinobarometro, which is one of the big regional polls, when you ask people in Latin America whether they think that the political system works to further the common interest, or alternatively, whether it works to further the interest of the powerful few over 80% of people choose the latter. I mean, it is no wonder that they feel that they have no skin in the game. They have no stake in the system. It is very difficult to build a stable democracy if people don't feel invested in it. If people don't feel that the political system is taking their voices and their interests into account. So the question of inequality is essential for the future of democracy. And I would argue, and there has been a lot of discussion over the past few years, is probably essential also for the future of free markets.
Mm-hmm. Jerzy, can I bring you in?
Thank you.
Capital S socialism, but also what I might call small s socialism, the high-tax social democracies that are common around Europe. And sometimes the branding, I had to use that word for a political system, sometimes that gets confused. What's your experience of differentiating those two things and how young people around the continent react to them?
Well, let me first come back to what I wanted to do at first stage when I heard the question, because the question was originally not about kind of big meta discussion whether democracy and capitalism can go hand in hand, and whether development of economy depends on democracy. This is a very important debate, but I think the question was more pragmatically directed. It is a question about what is the role of multinational company in pursuing certain or respecting certain values, or at least not harming. And I think here we can even narrow it down to certain specific sphere of free mindsets that is simply access to information in independent media. If we look, for example, how disinformation is supported, those machineries, if we take Russian case, for example, are partially financed by those multinational companies, not only by the Russian budget, and same in case of China. A lot of money comes from advertising industry toward those TV stations who at the same time disseminating a lot of kind of toxic narratives. So, and same, of course, if we go back to discussion about the role in this, the dissemination information by big tech, Facebook and others, we can also add another layer of a discussion. So there is a lot of responsibility. So we can narrow down to very simple responsibilities. If we have a big multinational companies, they are placing their advertisement in this and that government channel of authoritarian regimes, they have to spend equally at least 10% of same amount supporting independent media, as much as this or as little as this. And they are not doing so. So here, and same with the big tech. I mean, you have some foundations set up by this or those big tech that are now trying to get involved in supporting independent media all over the world, but it is still not enough. So I think here is a very quick solution that we can apply, and a quick way of engaging big multinational companies in bigger responsibility for a free flow of information, for supporting public interest media, for creating environment for civil society activists to grow and to perform whatever they would like to perform. And I think that this is the first element that I wanted to point attention in responding to this specific question that was raised. But your question is, of course, of much bigger value. And I think, honestly, I have no answer to that. I rather struggle with this question, because whenever I go to many of my activists on the ground, be it in North Africa or other places, I rather hear another question: how we can pursue democracy and the values that you are now trying to help us in pursuing, and what we could answer to the people that are telling us, in 19th century, when Europe was building its own wealth, you were not that democratic. So today you are promoting democracy and democratic values, but you are already rich. And that is a not easy question. And when I talk to those most charismatic young leaders on the ground, they are either Salafist or Marxist. And believe me, coming from the country and all my life fighting with Marxists, it's quite a challenge to talk to them and to answer those difficult questions. I have some answers in a practical sense that I can explain them, explaining them that those ideologies failed to deliver social order, and democracy is a bad system that has a lot of troubles, but there is no better one.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I might pick it up to run through the other 4 speakers now, Jersey. Thank you. And your media point lets me bring in one final audience question as we go through the panelists. And the question comes from Thomas Dodd, and he's noting the defunding of Voice of America and other government-funded media outlets. And his question isn't specifically about the defunding, but going through the Voice of America's, the BBC World Services, and so on. Question is, are they dinosaurs now and no longer fit for purpose? Should they be reformed, or do they need to be deleted and something else go in its place? And I'd add the context point for anyone not familiar with the debate, that when we see Western media outlets withdraw from some regions like the Balkans, you certainly see RT and Sputnik rush in, and there's certainly other powers that use this previously Western model to propagate their own perspective on the world. Maybe we'll do it in reverse order. I'll start with you, Dan, and then we'll end with you, Nicole.
So I think we're all struggling with this in the free world, the fact that our great power autocratic competitors are running very sophisticated propaganda machines, using things like CGTV in China, using things like RT and Sputnik in the Kremlin. Free societies aren't going to run global propaganda operations. I think our interest collectively is in helping people behind various internet firewalls get access to free and objective information, get access to free and objective investigative reporting on what's going on in their countries, because people in countries like China, Russia, Iran live in an information vacuum, an information bubble, in which they cannot frankly make their own choices without full information, which their governments very actively censor. So then the question, of course, Ryan, you'll have more to say about this than I will, about what is the correct funding model for journalism in free and open societies. It's not going to look anything like CGTV or RT. And this is something that we are all struggling with. I'd like to just take 10 seconds to come back to Kevin's very good point about inequality, because I completely agree that inequality is an extraordinary risk to both democratic practice and free markets. I would like to say that I don't think the problem is with the free markets bit. I think in Latin America, as in many other countries, you have seen various forms of predatory capitalism, of mercantilism, of various acute political forms of corruption. Certainly in countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua. And so I would just like us to distinguish between kind of the idea of a free and open economy that can deliver and is accessible to everyone, and the fact that political elites conduct state capture to reap rents from non-free economies.
Derek, I'll bring you in.
Well, just pick up on that point really quickly, if I can, before I get to the media point. I think the term socialism, I think you mentioned this, Ryan, the term socialism is sort of bandied about in sort of summary terms. And I don't think people are talking about going to becoming Venezuela or Cuba. I think what Kevin is talking about is exactly right. We talk about dignity when we talk about democracy. Democracy needs to deliver. And Madeleine Albright likes to say people need to vote and eat. So we talk about dignity, we talk particularly about political dignity, but people need economic dignity. They need to have a sense that the system works for them. They need a job as well as political rights. So if you don't give them that, if democracy doesn't deliver those basic needs, you're going to have people looking for an alternative. So it's absolutely essential when we talk about, quote, socialism, that it's not the socialism of a Venezuela, Cuba, but more the somewhat more redistributive or some economic rights that give people some dignity. On the media point, it's actually not defunding these organizations. They just kind of, the new person installed by Trump has wiped out the leadership of all these organizations, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, et cetera. But yes, they need to evolve with the times. But we need to have, we got rid of the US Information Agency, which was a very important effort through the Cold War to get our information out there to shape understanding of the United States. The Chinese, as Dan says, are fighting this war. It's very important in the social media age that we get out there and we're thinking strategically and smartly and creatively about how to get our get facts out there, to get the truth into countries that are closed, as well as simply demonstrate the value of a free media. Yeah, we need to evolve with the new tools and the new era that we're in, but we absolutely need these institutions to do this. And I just want to say, finally, since I have the floor, a year ago when I was in Copenhagen, I was sitting side by side and actually did a podcast with Mircea Geoană. She was there. So I just want to give a shout out to her, that just thinking of her, that she represents the best when it comes to courageous, independent media. And Duterte is demonstrating what it is to take a democratic forum and destroy it and function. And I think it's something we all need to keep an eye on. And I hope next year, when we're all back in Copenhagen, that she's there with us once again.
Thank you, Derek, for that. Kevin.
Thank you, Ryan. I mean, I'll do pretty much what Derek just did. I mean, I would like to say a word first about the question of inequality and markets. I mean, look, I'm sitting here at one of the most open economies in the world, Sweden, which happens to have a very robust welfare state, right? And welfare states make societies more resilient. Being unemployed in Sweden is not the same, quite frankly, as being unemployed in the US or Costa Rica, for that matter. Well, I happen to think that that's better for the working of the markets, and that's better for the workings of democracy. Because actually, one of the things that welfare states do is they lower the levels of social uncertainty. And that's crucial for the future of democracy. About the BBC and Voice of America and all that, I mean, I don't know enough about, media markets to be able to answer that question. I'm only going to say one thing, which is that, I mean, we can have a discussion about that. To me, the point is more basic. I mean, one of the crucial parts of the struggle to protect democracy going forward is about protecting media, full stop. Protecting free media, full stop. I don't care if it's the BBC or if it's a very small outlet online, but we have to protect the free media. We have to protect free media against censorship, as we have to protect it against disinformation. And that's, I think, a twilight struggle that we have ahead of us for the foreseeable future, and then some.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Nicole, the final word goes to you.
Excellent, thank you. Just a quick word. I'll echo what's been said. Our competitors, other authoritarian governments, are in the game on providing information in other societies, and free countries, democratic countries, have to be in the game. And not in the game to be competitive, but to be in the game because everyone around the world needs free information, access to the truth and access to information in order for them to advocate for their rights, to be able to advocate for a free society for each of them. So I don't know the details of whether it should be the same format as VOA or be adapted. We're obviously in a much different information environment, so we need to adapt to that. But it's unquestionable that this should be a strategic goal for the United States and certainly for other democratic countries. But I'll just say one final word. Our panel is about unity and united in democracy. And what we're seeing now is that underpinning every issue, whether it is the pandemic, whether it is racism, whether it's inequality, many of these issues, there is a massive difference between how democracies can and should be responding and how authoritarian governments are responding. And so when we look at this question of where do we have alliances, where do we have unity, where do we have joint action, there's no doubt that that democratic thread has to be pulled throughout all of our alliances and throughout all of our collaboration, whether that's a governmental action or a non-governmental action. It is now so much, it's even more crucial now than it ever has been for us to unite around these values to ensure that we're responding in a way which is consistent with those values.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank each of you for joining this discussion. I certainly found it illuminating. I won't individually thank all of you. I'll give you a collective thanks. And I want to say that there are representatives from each of your organizations joining the next round of breakout sessions. So I'm going to do a quick reminder of that, and then everyone's got 10 minutes off to make a coffee, run to the toilet, whatever it is that you need to do. And we'll be starting in 10 minutes time with those sessions. So breakout 1 is keeping democracy activism alive during COVID-19, getting you to share your stories. Registered participants should use the link in the email that you received already. Breakout 2, you can stay tuned right here. You don't need to change anything. The topic there is elections and disinformation, keeping on the democratic track. And breakout 3, again, you'll need the link that was emailed to registered participants, and that topic is ensuring women's rights during a pandemic. So thank you so much. And if you're leaving us now, we're starting again at 1 p.m. Copenhagen time tomorrow with an absolute great lineup of national leaders and other panelists. So thank you so much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Olaf Böhnke. I'm a senior advisor at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation and to the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. Thanks for tuning in. This is the live show. So we have 3 breakout sessions right now, but this is the one which will be broadcast on all our channels. So thank you very much for picking this one. Also, thank you very much to our cooperation partners, namely the institutions of NDI, IRI, the EED and the Bush Center for supporting our efforts to jointly defend democracy across the world. Just a very short housekeeping announcement. At a later stage, we will give you the option to ask questions to the panel. And if you want to do so, please start immediately putting your questions either in the comment section of the various social media channels or use the Q&A chat in the virtual conference room. And without much further ado, I give the floor to our excellent moderator, Tanne Koch, who is a professional journalist from Germany. She's the managing director of the German news TV channel NTV, and she's the editor-in-chief of RTL Newsroom, and we couldn't be in better hands. So again, thanks you for tuning in, and the floor is yours, Tanne.
Thanks, Olaf. Thanks for the praise. I hope I'll be up for that. No pressure after that introduction. It's great to have you all. It will be even greater to meet in person in Copenhagen. But I'm sure there'll be a time between COVID-19 and COVID-20 when we can all do so. Thank you so much for sharing and joining this panel through a zillion time zones. I think we can all agree that the right to vote and to be elected and to hold free and fair elections is one of the absolute essentials in any democracy, but the protection of human lives for any political decision maker has to probably rank equal. So the practical question in a pandemic, let it be, as said, COVID-19, COVID-20, or whichever virus comes next, is quite practically, how do we host elections in a pandemic and what specific threats are there that must be tackled? And as that's my personal view, I think we often have a rather self-centered view in sort of Center Europe and the US when it comes to global questions. I'm very glad that at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, we have a diverse group of participants here in this breakout session. So for everybody watching and listening, let me just quickly introduce our panel in alphabetical order. So there's Luis Sardo, who's a Guatemalan journalist and the founder of Conformado, a project that seeks to combat disinformation. There is Mr. Darko Brkan. He's a social activist. He's director of Zastone. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly, which means why not? And is a Sarajevo-based NGO that promotes civic activism, governmental accountability, and democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We also introduce Mrs. Nanmo Sandy Luang. Forgive my appalling, I tried, but I just failed. She's a senior program officer at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Myanmar, and she concentrates on local capacity building, trainings, and civil society programs around democratic goals, among many other tasks. And last but not least, is Mr. Woo Min Shun, who I will call TT Cat, which is his nickname, and you might explain to us what he is and where it came from. He's the co-founder and CEO of Double Thing Lab, an organization that researches modern threats to democracy and counter strategies against these threats. TT outlets the focus on mapping China's online information operation, may also say disinformation operation maybe, in Taiwan. So thank you all for joining this panel. Question, I think, is not so much for us one year, but why aren't there any even more panels like this? Presentations, it'll be much more conversation whenever you have something you share, and I'm not looking there yet. You already think I might overlook you to raise your hand, and I'll try to fit in. So we will talk about democracy action and the pandemic and what we can learn from this. So let's start with Myanmar, because the latest election, I think, was held in November 2015, and you have one coming up as far as I'm for this year. So can you explain to us the situation in your home country and what has changed because of the pandemic? And you must unmute yourself at first. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah,
Yes. Excellent.
I can hear only a cut off. So could you please me again? Yeah.
Okay. So forgive me. I hope we won't have any more technical problems. So I think there is an election coming up this year in Myanmar. So can you explain to us the situation in your country at the moment and what will change for this election because of the pandemic?
This year is the critical year for our country of Myanmar. So, well, for the time being, so the people are struggling during the global pandemic coronavirus crisis. And also the COVID-19 global pandemic since early 2020 has become a critical tax on the social cohesion in Myanmar. So a lot of hate speech and disinformation spreading on the social media. So also it causes the people lack of the trust, trust in the political trust. So, and almost half of the populations, about 20 million, have started using the social media. So mostly Facebook as their main source of news, popular media, and other forms of mass media, mass informations. So at that time, we started to find out that hate speech is spreading both online and offline in Myanmar. So particularly people use Facebook in negative way to spread the accusations and rumors by reposting old news and sharing misleading videos. So this can affect for our voters. There are 5 million of voters. 5 million of people in Myanmar are the first-time youth voters. So especially, but most of the Facebook users are mostly young people. So how could we encourage and motivate to counter hate speech and disinformation spreading on the social media? So this is a really challenging moment in Myanmar. So we are giving awareness to the voters to counter and how to fact check, how to spot the fake news on the social medias, like consider the source. So check the author. So another one is check the date. So where the information's from. Check your bias, and we ask them to read beyond and supporting sources. And is it a joke? So and ask the experts. So all these things are we are giving we are giving all these informations to among the young voters to get the accurate information about the electoral process and about the electoral news.
Can I just ask, because this I think was a problem even before COVID-19. So what has changed specifically because of the pandemic? What do you fear will happen in this election that might not have happened last year before Corona, before the virus?
Yeah, so I think people, the voters are still they are feeling that they are struggling to during the COVID-19 crisis, as well as we have the elections. So they are secure their health and security. So they are sometimes they might be worried. So why they are going to the polling stations? Polling stations are secure for their health, or do they have enough capacities for the voters to be able to vote in the polling stations safely? So something like that, or lots of questions and lots of confusions among the voters. So these are the challenges. But this is the pre-electoral, pre-election period, pre-elections period. So we have a lot of procedures, electoral procedures to during this period. So I think I hope we could handle the elections during the COVID-19 crisis period. So this is not only the responsible for the government, but also to coordinate with the voters and the electoral management bodies and the government. So we work together, collaborate together to to resist the to build our resilience for our critical moment of elections.
Thank you. Moving to you, TTCAT. First of all, could you explain that nickname? I'm curious.
I have a cat. Her name is Titi. She's been with me for 17 years so far. So that's how I get this nickname.
Okay. So one question to you. I think Taiwan just had elections in January. So you just, great timing, sort of avoided any turmoil or any massive influence of the virus. But in your sort of worst case scenario thinking, imagine the elections would be in, I don't know, 4 weeks or next week even. What threats do you see specifically because of COVID-19?
Yeah, so we had our presidential election on January 11th. And then the first disinformation related to COVID-19, what we're seeing is actually the day before the voting day. There's a message spreading on the Facebook and also Line, which is a messenger app like WhatsApp, telling people that there's already confirming case in Taiwan by this unknown pneumonia virus from Wuhan. So people, if you want to go to vote, you should remember to wear the face mask. But it's just happened like one day, and by the time people are not really familiar about the coronavirus at all, so the voting rate is very, very high. We got around like 80% or 70-something% voting rates. Yeah, and also we had another election in local city just a few weeks ago about recall a Kaohsiung city mayor. And I think because Taiwan at the very first adopting this transparency and openness daily press conference from our central DC control, they publish every information to the public. So it really doesn't affect the election. But in the worst scenario, I can imagine that I just read in an article by last month. There's a study from Federal Reserve Bank of New York saying that there's a study indicate Spanish flu actually reshaped the German society and political system between 1918 to 1920. It showed that voting behavior has changed in cities and very, very high and often in favor for the Nazis. So I would say that the epidemic is actually the perfect soil that foster all kinds of authoritarian regimes. And we see many our neighboring countries are deploying a lot of a surveillance system under the name of the combating epidemic. So that's something really a threat to the election and the democracy.
Mm-hmm. You have to send that study about the Spanish flu in Germany to me because I've never heard of it. It sounds really interesting. I've got to check. Luis, you're a journalist, but you had an earlier career, I think, as a firefighter. So alluding to that, when you look at the current situation in your, which one is the biggest regarding democracy? Which one would you put up first if you had a chance?
Yes, hello. For us, it's very important to have all the information and the facts, and there are not all the facts, not all the information to the public. So the public is creating a lot of hoaxes, stories around coronavirus. And at the beginning, they were very, very strict on the things related to the lockdown. And right now, when the curve is going higher, everyone wants to go out. So for the emergency medical services, it's very, very complicated situation because there are a lot of people in the streets, and of course they doesn't have a lot of equipment, a lot of resources. and there's not a lot of information. So people are doing many things that they shouldn't be doing right now.
Thank you, Luis. What do you think, not as a firefighter, but as a journalist, would be the best practical way to, if you had all the resources and all the means in the world, what way would you choose to tackle this problem, to put out that fire?
Okay, it's very complicated because it depends on each society. But for example, for us, it would be education, media literacy, and teach people how to spot and fight misinformation, because misinformation is going to be around every year, every time. So we have to learn how to spot, how to fight, how to counter misinformation, hate speech, and everything related to that, because that's the only way. Young people right now, even young people, they can spot some things that are fake, and they are beginning to do that on social media, but they're just small efforts. So we have to focus on education, and I think education is the basis of everything that we should do later on.
I think we get to that point later on. And Darko, it's good to have you. Actually, Bosnia-Herzegovina is just an hour and a half flight away from at least Berlin. So it seems very, very close, but you have problems different to that of other countries. If you could explain the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, what in your view is currently the biggest threat to strengthening Bosnia-Herzegovina? Is a democracy, but what's the biggest threat to strengthening this democracy even further? And has this changed because of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, we're going to see whether it's a democracy or not in November, because we have local elections that are, like, at this moment 50-50 chance of happening, because we currently have a proposal for the new budget or state budget, and it doesn't include elections, even though by law they should be up in November. So basically we'll see about the Bosnia being democracy by the end of the year. So basically the pandemic has kind of emphasized and shown all the weaknesses that the country has, like the division, different measures in different parts of the country, different ways of accepting, like, blaming each other for the proliferation of cases. So, like, it's the usual Bosnian story, the pandemic way. That's what has been happening, and you can pretty much say that about the whole Balkans region. I mean, it's not different. Like, just thinking about the state of democracy in the whole region, we're going to have 3 elections in the region in the next month's time. So basically, in 3 days we have the elections in Serbia. Then in the next month we have Croatia and North Macedonia also up for elections, and then Bosnia and Montenegro probably until the end of the year. So I guess that the whole regional democracy is going to be tested until the end of the year. I mean, we might not be as proliferant in cases as other parts of the world during the pandemic, but in terms of everything else, like, the disinformation, the level of disinformation around it, the amount of theory of conspiracies, the like big geopolitical issues being settled through the region, through disinformation, all the way to what Titi Cat has already mentioned, like this showing of authoritarian ways of government in the region. I think each and every government in the region has been using, like, more measures than necessary in order to kind of, like, let's say, even prepare for the upcoming elections. There are even, like, definite examples of different measures that are against human rights being used in order to gain some momentum for the elections or gain some advantage. So all of this we've seen both in Bosnia and the region. And Bosnia is probably going to see it more because the elections will be approaching, hopefully, if they even happen. So that in some cases even the pandemic might be used, and I'm guessing it's going to be used as an excuse for not holding the elections in Bosnia if they are not held in the end. So, like, the usual problems, just the pandemic way, probably emphasized a couple of times, and that's the story of the region. You have, like, on election lists of parties, you have people who were the biggest propagators of theories of conspiracy around like the pandemic, just because they are popular now in the region, and then all the parties are even fighting for these people to be on their list, because, you know, like now being a theory of conspiracy propagator is a popular thing here in the region. And then like all the way to boosting your, like, you know, public appearance with using measures that are against human rights, but then, like, you know, just kind of being populistic in a way that it adheres to some people. And, like, you know, this region not being affected that much by the pandemic was not because of the measures, was because of pure luck. We don't travel as much as the rest, and then, like, you know, the measures were introduced pretty early on, and that's the reason why actually in the end the region was pretty free of cases, not because the governments have done a marvelous job of stopping it. And we're gonna see now how it goes after the measures have been lifted a little bit. So we'll see.
Follow-up question: do you see a lot of Russian influence in the region at the moment?
Well, I mean, Russian influence has been there for a while, and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, not in a way that you would see like in the rest of the, probably in Central Europe or the countries in Central Europe that used to be like in the Warsaw Pact. But, like, you know, we see local propagators here that are very much in line with, like, you know, who needs direct Russian influence when you have, like, you know, political parties that are in government that are promoting Russian influence in the region. So, like, you know, it's a mixture of everything, and it's also even in looking into that, it's a very unique region compared to the rest, because we don't have only direct influence, we have local propagators, even governmental ones that are propagating that. So, you know, it's an open game here in the region very much.
So I think we've sort of covered a couple of the problems, and I think we could do that for hours and hours and days and weeks to follow. But let's look at, because you're all involved in actually tackling those problems, let's look at maybe possible solutions or best practices. Nemo, you're involved in trainings in civic education. So can you share a couple of success stories where you think you made a difference, your organization made a difference?
So now, as friends before the pandemic coronavirus crisis in Myanmar, so we plan to conduct the civic and voter education programs across the country. So especially this period is to be able to conduct the civic educations across the country, especially in the rural areas. So because one thing is in Myanmar, so the townships. Every township cannot access the internet, so that in-person civic education program is really effective, especially in the rural areas. So that our civil societies from our communities, so they are planning to conduct civic educations in all these areas. So, but because of the government instructions and restrictions, traveling to one the state to another state and the region. So we change the civic education style. So we conduct the civic education through the Zoom. So, but this is also one of the challenge in Myanmar as well, because the technical issue, internet issue. So especially as you all know, they're in Rakhine, so some townships cannot access the internet because of the internet breakdown or shutdown in some of the townships in Rakhine. So the people, what do we do? The people in in Rakhine state. So we were thinking that we selected the focal persons from the respected areas like Yangon, Mandalay, and the capital cities of the state and regions, and we conduct the civic education program on the Zoom. So at that time, a little bit we face some challenges like technical issues and also the language issue. So, but for ethnic areas, so sometimes they can't understand very well about in Burma language. So we have the interpreters. So interpretations, the sessions also provided for those focal community members. So another one is, so like our civic education program is the inclusive civic education program. So not only for the young people, women, so we let them in, let women groups, marginalized groups, and the LGBTQI people from the LGBTQI community and person with disabilities. So we arrange all these things and we conduct the civic educations right now. So hopefully it will affect to counter hate speech and disinformation, to assess the accurate informations for the electoral informations from the social media. So all these things. So hopefully they will get it. And after that, we are planning that the focal persons will share all these information throughout the country. So we are I think this is it will helpful for our country, the democratic transition period. So because 2020 election is really important for our country as well.
Thank you. And I see TG Cat nodding. So can you relate to what has just been, because Taiwan and Myanmar are totally different, obviously, but can you relate to some of the things said just now by Nenmo?
So of course, so these collectively action and activities by the civil society is always the best solution we have for all of us. And I think the people who hold down to the transparency, openness, democracy values should all come together. So Taiwan during the last election period, so which started from last year, we've been very highly aware that there's a Chinese information operation happening. So the disinformation, the propaganda campaign, or the cyber troops are the very hot topics during the whole election period, and that it also extend to the epidemic period so far. So I would say that there's a lot of civil society organization do the fact checking or very quickly try to debunk suspicious operation on Facebook, and Facebook opened the war room during the election that also helped to downsize the spread of those disinformation by very, very quickly. And I think, yeah, those stuff are what we really leave us the room to fully doing more research on understand how's their mechanisms and strategies and developing tools for respond to those challenges.
Do you think, because you follow the international discussions, political scene, media scene, and you're geographically quite close to China, do you think that US and European leaders / media are too soft on China at the moment? We're sort of with TikTokers and everybody's not really, and Huawei, yeah, there are a couple of discussions, but even when it comes to the disinformation about the outburst actually of COVID, in a couple of, I'd say, German outlets, there's been more talk of what happened in skiing resorts in Austria, and how the outbreak wasn't properly handled there. Then people talk about China, which is sort of the elephant in the room.
Yes, I would say yes. Maybe there's a lot of similarity narrative you already been heard of it. Give you some example, like people at the very, very first saying that this virus is nothing compared to US flu, H1N1 from the US, which already killed 6,600 people. But then nobody criticized US, they didn't lock down the city at all, but they criticized China. Why is that? Because of racism. That's come from China. And also another propaganda saying that the COVID-19 is actually brought by US Army to Wuhan military war game last November. So that's also very widespread and also translating to many, many different languages. Still happen today. So I see that the Western media, well, I wouldn't say especially American media actually pick up those topics quite often. But in Europe, I don't see that much about the people paying attention on those Chinese disinformation. And also that, the international fact-checking network, they opened up this COVID-19 allies to fact-checking all these COVID-19 related disinformation. And then there's only 2 organizations who understand Chinese and can verify those sources for the fact-checking initiative around the world, which one in Hong Kong, another one in Taiwan. So I would say that if we can contribute to the global communities or the partners here about that, if you need to verify or understand about the Chinese model, about this propaganda around the world. So yeah, that's where I think we can, as a Taiwanese, could contribute.
Thank you. And moving on to Darko, you're working on a digital toolkit, as I understand, to sort of further and promote democracy. Have you worked sort of COVID testing or vaccine into this toolkit, or was your biggest project regarding this work of yours?
Well, I mean, we are as I see much of the rest of the speakers, we are mostly dealing with this information and that's kind of promoting accountability. So basically fact-checking, the politicians fact-checking, the media, that's where we are most prominent. And then we're trying to kind of establish these channels of communication of citizens with different institutions, different levels of government. So that's basically the flagships that we do, and most of our pandemic related work was, I mean, we just kind of moved half of our staff from everything else they've been doing to combating disinformation. That's how big the proliferation was during the pandemic. So we didn't freeze most of other work, but we kind of put it on minimum and then mostly moved everybody to that portion of the work, because it was unprecedented so far in anything that we've seen before. I think that regionally between 7 newsrooms that are dealing with this information in this region, we've published I think 600 fact checks during 1.5 or 2 months during the peak of the pandemic, which is probably 3 or 4 times more than we would usually do in the same period. And at the same time, the increase in the number of readers of our outlets was some 800%, which is I mean, probably the similar increase on the disinformation side was seen at the same time. But I'm just saying that the levels of interest for the topic were not seen before. And at the same time, I think our biggest challenge in the whole thing probably is not the disinformation itself or the propagators. There are these two challenges that we have. One is the level of media literacy in the region, which was already kind of mentioned by pretty much everybody on the panel. But I would definitely emphasize the low level of involvement of tech companies in the whole process, and I think that needs to be improved. I mean, I know that some regions in the world have a much better commitment and much better processes in terms of combating disinformation supported by the tech companies, whereas the Balkans region is totally left alone. We've suffered probably, I think I didn't count, but 6 or 7 closures of our accounts during the pandemic by the tech companies, just because they were thinking we are the ones spreading this information rather than fighting it. So we had more issues ourselves fighting this information than the ones spreading it. In terms of how the tech companies treated us. So I would definitely emphasize that as a challenge that we need to overcome quickly, and also as a big opportunity, because I think that with smaller efforts at this level, by a good involvement in the region, the tech companies could definitely reach things here and solve a lot of problems.
Just one quick question. Does when you talk about the tech companies, do Twitter, Facebook, and Google, do they actually have representatives in your country that don't just cover ad services, but also sort of stuff like information or policy? Do you have somebody? Is there somebody you can talk to?
Yeah, well, I mean, we as a part of the international fact-checking network and all the global connections that we have, we do have some communication with tech companies, but the problem is that actually so far outside of Croatia, which is the EU member, and that's why they have committed to Croatia. Outside of Croatia, no other country has had even like a third-party fact-checking status from Facebook. There's not a single organization. We've been doing, for instance, fact-checking in Bosnia for more than 10 years, and we still don't have even the third-party status from Facebook, let alone anything else. So, like, you know, it is an issue in all sorts, and we need to definitely, I think that this needs to be addressed, and because, you know, the Balkans region might not be big in terms of numbers or not a big market, but in terms of the geopolitical position and like the level of influence of different global players, and you know, obviously the level of disinformation that's being served here, it is very crucial and urgent for them to start paying attention to the region much more.
Exactly, and I think we can still remember the war, which was actually the last one we had in Europe.
Yeah, and the repercussions of that still last. I mean, I would say that the region is probably more of a ceasefire than peace at the moment. Like, you know, yeah.
So talking about the tech companies, I was trying to sort of shift that to a later part of our conversation, but bringing both tech companies and the US president into the discussion. So you probably all noticed the tweet Donald Trump posted a couple of days ago, actually weeks, and he wrote, "There's no way that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent. Mailboxes will be robbed, ballots will be forged, etc." So this is obviously not true in the US, and I'd say it's obviously true in Germany and many other countries in the world. Moving on to Luis, would you say that postal ballots, I'm just trying to keep it a little practical here, postal ballots in a pandemic could be an option for you? That's something that is already done. Would you consider it straight away? Would Donald Trump calling it fraudulent be right, but I don't know, you would be parts of it? Or would that be in case of nobody able to leave the house or the flat? Would that be a chance to have an election instead of postponing it?
Sorry, I couldn't hear all the question because it was like cutting. Can you repeat, please?
Yes, sorry. I hope it's not my Wi-Fi. Being in Germany, the net quality here is definitely not what it should be in an industrialized country. Question is, do you think postal ballots in the case of a pandemic could be an alternative, could be the solution if people weren't allowed to leave their houses or their flats? Mailing the vote and not sending it a post and not going to an election office or a ballot.
Okay, it's I couldn't hear, but I can say something about it. Right now, all the information and the misinformation about coronavirus is weaponized against the government, because I have to say this is a part of the context. For the last government, they have like a lot of agencies and a lot of what we call net centers. If you don't know what is a net center, it's an organization, an agency that offers a service that you can pay, and they have like a desk of troll farms, troll factories, and everything around that to spread misinformation, do character assassination, and all that kind of tactics. And they were working with the past government, and when the new government that took office in the middle of January, they came with a lot of different teams. So they are right now attacking the actual government. So this is going to be weaponized for many months, I think, and it's going to affect the next elections. For example, right now we have for the Supreme Court Justice elections this year, and it's like very difficult because all the media is focusing on coronavirus and everything is related to that. and no one is watching or fact-checking or whatever related to that elections that are not public elections, because they are made by some members of universities, the public universities, and lawyers and everything about that. So they are like doing a lot of things without the media viewing that, or at least trying to report on that. Of course, there are reports. Of course, there is a lot of pieces and articles about that, but not the focus right now is coronavirus and the lack of information from the government. So there are a lot of people, possibly they will be candidates for the next elections, that will weaponize everything that is happening right now. And because we have a lot of agencies, we have a lot of net centers right now, it's gonna be like an information war, and people are in the middle. They don't know what to expect, what to believe, and this pollution, this information pollution that we have right now is very, very complicated to fight. So it's gonna be very difficult. Even the next, our next elections, general elections, is going to be 2.5 years from now. So I think it's going to be very hard for us.
I think we have technical audio problems, so forget my questions. It was really, really interesting what you said. I'd like to pose one to Darko and TTCAT, because you are in sort of developing online digital engineering, etc. If you met Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai from Facebook and Google, and they granted you one wish, what would it be? What would you wish for?
Okay. I believe that they have the power not to interfere the information that is flowing in many directions, but they have the power at least to let academic members to study. They are doing some efforts, but not enough. For example, here in Guatemala, we are, like Dark said, doesn't even exist for them. They doesn't have offices here. They doesn't have any member here. They doesn't believe they should have any efforts here. But if I have the opportunity, I will ask to create a space where journalists and academic members should be allowed to be part of like a board that could not censor, but could guide some regulations around the platform. Not only Facebook, but maybe all the platforms.
TTCAT, what about you? What wish would you?
It's a separate wish for Google and Facebook,
okay,
or just one wish?
No, it's fine, because it's so different.
All right, so for Google, I think Google need a Google version Cambridge Analytica scandal for them to fully realize what's the problem on their own kind of a platform, like a Google search and also YouTube and also Google mobile phone. So as all of you know that on the desktop, on your computer, on your browser, you can add a lot of a plugin for warning you to give you a lot of features, or warning you the website you are watching right now is actually content farm or a misinformation, and alert by the third-party fact-checking initiative, right? But all these plugin is not allowed in both Apple phone or Android mobile phone. They just feel like they are not in this game at all, especially Apple. Apple don't allow any kind of plugin or third-party script for the Safari browser on the cell phone, right? So I would say that to those tech company, look at your cell phone mobile app and try to improve that and work with third-party fact-checking initiative or other organization and try, because more and more people actually read those information from the mobile app or from a mobile device. And that's something we should really pay attention to it. That's my wish.
A very profound one. Darko, moving to you. What's your wish?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could probably write up a 100-page strategy of like what I would like to see, but like let me try to be very brief and like, you know, if I would have only one thing to say in like 10 seconds, I would say probably something like, for every cent you earn from this information, spend 1 cent to fight it. And that's pretty much it, like, you know, because the amounts they are earning on spreading this information are huge. And I think that's kind of like, you know, what's at the same time stopping the fight for this information. So if these things would be equal, I would be more than satisfied.
Thank you. Nanmo, there was an article in the New York Times in 2018. I think the headline read, what if your country is Tinderbox and Facebook is the match? You know, Tinderbox go up and fire very, very quickly. So the examples mentioned there were Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Mexico, but also Myanmar, when false rumors posted by social media, not just Facebook, called violence, sometimes even lynchings. That article was written 2 years ago, and at the time you mentioned that you do a lot of language, well, not education, but you need interpreters in your own country to talk to everyone. Facebook doesn't even have enough people speaking your language. So how should they monitor what is happening? And you say within the last 2 years things have improved regarding the social media platforms, or is it just the same as it used to be?
Yeah. So you know, in Myanmar, so like after 2015 and now until now, so 2020, so a lot of Facebook users are especially the young people. So like I think yeah. So the Facebook teams should have the proper the procedures of how to fact check and how to counter for the disinformation and hate speech spreading on the social media things. Yeah.
So I remember Facebook in the US started a sort of fact checkers alert, disputed content. And what actually happened, and I think it says a lot about humanity, is that posts with this tag, with this disputed tag, were shared even more because some people just like to do what they shouldn't, and so it actually had an opposite effect. So I think it's extremely difficult to find the one solution, and there may be a need for a zillion solutions, but that's not what those platforms are made for. Quite practically, a question to all of you, because we're trying in our election committee, we're trying to figure out whether the ballot itself is more vulnerable or the personal choice to go and vote. So in a pandemic, do you think that in a specific precinct, in a specific constituency, a social media rumor could keep people from turning up at the ballot and actually voting? Do you think that is possible, and do you think this could have a massive impact on an election in your country, whether it be local or regional?
Yes. Yeah, this is a massive influence for the voters. So particularly people use Facebook in a negative way to spread accusations and rumors by reposting old news and then sharing misleading videos, especially during the electoral period. So hate speech mostly emerge in the comments sections and post. So about the conflict-related news, IDPs or the refugee news, and the migrant workers who came across from the borders area. So during the the COVID-19 crisis. So lost thousands of the migrant workers from the border areas came to our country. So this is for our country. This is a good opportunities to get them to vote in the elections. So one thing is one thing is a hate speech and disinformation spreading on those particular targeted groups. So it causes the voting. It causes the lack of accurate informations. Can harm for the electoral for the election. So especially for example in our country, so if their names are not in the voter list, so they cannot get a chance to vote in the election. So it is important to encourage and motivate them to check their names on the voter list. Also, electoral management bodies needs the support of various institutions, institutions to to stop the hate speech and disinformations in the interest of protecting fundamental human rights. So I think, yeah.
Floor is open. Do you think rumors could immediately impact elections by people not turning up after being misinformed online?
Yeah, I can like just kind of have a thought or two on that. I mean, I think that definitely it changes the political landscape. I mean, and not only for elections, and it changes it in general. And I think that like the pandemic was kind of a sobering place for all of us to realize that. And I think that each following election is going to be more and more influenced with what's happening on the social media, and whether it's going to be the turnout or not turning out, that depends on how the situation develops and what the strategies are. We I think had the first here in Serbia, I mean not here but in the region in Serbia, I think we had the first rally on a Zoom platform, pre-election rally in the world so far. So things are rapidly changing. I mean, it was a PR stunt obviously, but it did happen with a politician going out in front of hundreds of screens of people watching him. So the whole landscape is changing, and the whole infrastructure of how we do politics is changing. So how much it's going to influence elections and how much it's going to be crucial for the way they are implemented or the results of them, it remains to be seen. But I think that definitely each and every next election is not going to be the same as the ones that we are used to before.
I think because we only have about 20 minutes to go, we should open the questions to the audience. And you've seen me sort of sneakily glance away, so I've got the questions on my phone, and I'd like to start with one for I think TT Cat, asked by Professor Shastra. What strategy would you like to suggest Asian civil societies and democratic groups to adopt to weaken a growing attraction for the undemocratic model Republic by China? Represented by China, I think this abbreviation, but you got the gist of it.
Well, I think lots of civil society organization in the region especially, or Bureau Initiative countries are aware that the Chinese influence is getting stronger and stronger. And but how to approach and how to understand that, it depends on, it's kind of difficult because there's a language barrier, there's a culture difference that fully understand how the China's government operating their administrations and all kind of different branch, it's a mess. So I would say that, and also there's a risk. So some topic is much more dangerous than combating propaganda online, I would say. So I would say that I would suggest that the scale of this battle actually requires a global civil society cooperation to push back. So for the people who fund the Chinese or like Hong Kong or Taiwanese organizations to work with, or the overseas Chinese organization that to start with to understand and assess those risks and influence in their country and think about more collectively way to debunk those propaganda. And I would say that this is actually a war of not only narrative and the truth, but also the governance model. So democracy versus the authoritarian. With this epidemic, they are claiming their model is much more stronger than combating the COVID-19 or such things. And we need to show the world and the more general public about there's a alternative way, that democratic way, that we don't have to do that, but we can also contain the situation. Yeah.
Thank you. Here's another one by Pearl Matibe. I guess to all of you, but whoever has the best idea, just go first. So the question reads, do you have 3 strategies and tactics that you could share for independent journalists as steps or as apps to use to fact check an autocratic regime institutions where access to information is extremely difficult? Who has the best tactics or strategies to tackle disinformation against an autocratic regime, or in an autocratic regime where information is extremely difficult? Not everyone at the same time. Luis, we haven't heard from you.
Okay. For the last years, I've been doing open source intelligence. So maybe independent journalists wish to learn about OSINT. It has a lot of resources. It gives a lot of tools that let information flow to the journalist or even the newspaper or the media. So they can track, investigate, localize, and gather information and then analyze it, and they can also visualize. So maybe that's the point that they should go to open source intelligence.
Anyone wants to share?
Yeah, I mean, this is like, you know, from being from a region that's kind of like, you know, always being told what to do, like, you know, from different people. I don't feel comfortable saying to people like what they should do. I think it's all about the local context and particularities of a certain situation. So, like, you know, in my opinion, I think that in these cases, the best thing you can do is try to raise your profile, try to kind of like, you know, create a safety net first, and then, like, you know, once people are aware of you, what you're doing, your existence, and, like, you know, generally once you raise the price of yourself, then it's easier to work even in oppressive regimes. I mean, that's at least my opinion, but, like, you know, I usually hesitate giving any advices to anybody else in elsewhere, because, like, you know, I think it's all about the local context in most cases.
I absolutely agree with you. On the other hand, if people seek advice and they can decide for themselves whether your advice or strategies or tactics will help them in their local context, and I think it's actually quite an interesting forum we have, because it's so diverse, and all our countries are so very, very specific and difficult, but I think there's some problems we have in common. And I think there may be some solutions we may have in common as well. TT Cat, do you have, we have 2 strategies so far. Do you have a third one?
Well, I wouldn't call it a solution, but I would like to share what we do here. So first thing is we are trying to build a monitoring database for message across platforms. So from Chinese media environment to Taiwanese Facebook, YouTube, or any other platforms. And because those messages right now brigading from each platform to another platform, sometimes they translate to another language. It's really, really difficult, but I think if we do have open source, open database for people to better understand the message you are reading actually is not originate in your own society, then you should be aware who is propagating those message and in what kind of a purpose, right? So that's something we do. But another thing I want to emphasize here is that I don't see much people try to study that why people believe such narrative and disinformation from a human perspective or psychology perspective. How we build a counter narrative and how we better communicate with those receiver or what we say victim of the disinformation. What's their motivation? What's their emotion behind why they want to believe such narrative? Probably because they feel they unheard or they have such unsatisfied. They want to be those narrative actually serve what they believe. So I would say that from this like a society engagement, social engagement part is what the civil society work and meant to be. So that's something we should really, really enhance.
Thank you very much, Titigat, for that really, really precise point. And although I'm just the moderator, I'd just like to emphasize what you've said, because I often feel that in particular, news media and journalists who often have a not very diverse background tend to look down upon people who don't have the same either mindset or the same level of information, and to belittle them. And I feel that that's something my country, which doesn't have a problem with election fraud mostly overall, but what we see here too, that people don't feel engaged and don't feel addressed by mass media and by some news media if they aren't talked to sort of on eye level. And whenever we journalists put ourselves on a pedestal and sort of raise our fingers and try and tell people what they should think, they react quite allergic against that. And I think that's something for our whole profession to really adopt, that if we want to reach people, we should talk in their language and not try to prove that we're better informed, which we often are. But people don't want to be told they're dumb hillbillies, because then they certainly won't listen. So there are two questions which sort of relate to each other. I'll start with the first one, and I'll read them out so you have a lot of time to think. So, question from Andrew Barden. What are some of the trade-offs we must address between being an anti-censorship society while also fighting misinformation? And this relates to Bjarke Nissen-Lykke, who asks, who will decide what information is disinformation, hate speech, etc.? Institutions and mechanisms for suppression of these kinds of speech are ripe for capture by authoritarian elements that can use it to suppress other kind of speech. So what is the panel's solution to this problem? Who wants to go first?
I can address that one. I mean, first of all, I totally believe in freedom of speech, and I don't think that, like, censorship should be a way to fight anything ever. Like, I think that, but I think that the game is not fair. I think we should definitely work on making the game more fair, and that's not censorship. That's more like, what I already said. Like, if a social tech company would basically, like, spend as much money on fighting this information as they are earning from it, then, like, that would be making the game more fair. But on the other hand, I believe that, like, there shouldn't be an authority on, like, deciding what's true, what's not. Like, I think that's something that's like the common public way of understanding. Like, journalism, on its side has always been fighting for truth and fighting for proper reporting on things, and I think that should stay the same no matter what the source or what the channel for spreading information is. Like, we should be fighting for the truth. And I think that, like, by doing it properly, by going to the sources, by checking everything, by being, like, critical about the information that we are getting, I think that should be the right judge, and that should be the strategy. Of course, in some ways, like, there should be institutional involvement by governments and societies in fighting this information, and, like, that should be definitely on the media literacy side, on enabling people to understand the the information and the way that it's spread, like, you know, on different fields. I think that should even the play field, but like, you know, straight up censorship or any form of it is not in my playbook at all. Like, you know, I don't trust in it at all.
Anybody else? Yes, Luis.
Okay. I have to tell, it's very different. I believe in freedom of speech. Sorry. I believe in freedom of speech, but I think we have to divide what people are saying and the tactics they are using to amplify what they are saying. So I focus mostly on the tactics and the strategies they are using to amplify, to harass, and everything. It's not the content of the message, because if we focus on the content of the message, that is censorship. But if you focus on what they are doing, if they are having decks of bots amplifying unauthentic behavior, doing doxing with private information, and they are using a lot of tactics. Those tactics have to be regulated, and that's my point. We doesn't have to focus on the message by itself. People has the right to say anything what they want, even if it's a lie. But if they are paying a lot of trolls, a lot of agencies to amplify that message, doing harassment to another person, that I think it has to be regulated. So we can focus our regulation on the tactics and what the actions that people are doing and the behavior they are showing in the platforms.
Thank you, Luis. Here's a question actually to me. I'll keep that very short. Are the EU countries adequately protected against disinformation, whether state-backed or not? If not, what provisions can be made by actors to combat disinformation? How can we look to other countries from around the world for lessons learned? Quite frankly, I don't think the EU is adequately protected against disinformation, and the funding by let's look at Brussels to tackle disinformation is definitely not what it should be. So I think whenever there's a discussion about how to, and that relates to what Darko said, do we tax the big tech companies properly within the EU? I think we should also always look at do we ourselves spend enough resources, time, and effort to do our job? And coming to I think one more question. We have time to, no, I mixed these up. On a more positive note, coming to the end, during the current Black Lives Matter movement in the US, we've seen people align for a greater cause in spite of, or perhaps exacerbated by, the current pandemic. How can we inspire the fight for democracy in a similar way? Okay, that's not an easy one. Nanmo, you've seen the pictures and videos of protesters on the street despite a pandemic, because the cause was so much theirs and it was so emotional. Is that something to learn from?
Like a freedom of freedom of speech is really its freedom of speech is really is leading for the democratic society. So like disinformations and hate speech and disinformation spreading among the societies. At other times, all the people from the societies needs to respond, combat all these like this. Yeah.
So thank you. I know this has been difficult because, again, different time zones, very different countries, very different backgrounds, as we've stressed. But I, for myself, have learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for being on this panel. Thanks to the audience. I don't know the numbers yet, but I'm sure we'll be told. I've been asked to relate another message by our organizers. We would be very, very grateful if everyone was able to tune in again tomorrow, since tomorrow we will welcome keynotes by Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen. TT, was that approximately right? Okay.
Ing-wen.
Thank you. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as his predecessors Madeleine Albright and John Kerry, plus Microsoft's President Brad Smith, plus Vera Jourova, the Vice President of the EU Commission. They'll all be in tomorrow, so tune in. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck with everything you're doing. I'm very impressed by what I've heard, and I hope we keep in touch. Have a good day or night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Dakar, nice to meet you.